The worst moment of my life began with champagne on the marble floor and my fiancé kissing someone else beneath a crystal chandelier. The Grand Crescent Hotel glittered like a jewel in the center of downtown Chicago, every gold-trimmed window glowing against the cold November rain outside, every polished surface reflecting wealth Ethan Carter had spent his entire life admiring from a distance. Tonight was supposed to be the beginning of his future. Instead, it felt like the end of it. Ethan stood frozen near the center of the ballroom while whispers spread through the crowd faster than wildfire. Expensive perfume filled the air. Soft violin music still played somewhere in the background, absurdly calm compared to the storm unraveling inside his chest. At the far end of the room, Ryan Keller smiled as though he hadn't just shattered someone's heart in front of 200 guests. Ryan's hand rested possessively on the waist of another Omega dressed in white silk and diamonds that probably cost more than Ethan's yearly rent. The cameras from local society magazines flashed relentlessly while guests pretended not to stare. But everyone was staring. Everyone. Ethan could feel it like heat crawling across his skin. Pity. Curiosity. Judgment. He heard fragments of hushed conversations drifting through the ballroom. That's his replacement. I heard the other family doubled the merger investment. Poor Ethan. Poor Ethan. The words hit harder than Ryan's betrayal. Ryan finally looked at him across the room, and somehow that hurt worst of all. There was no guilt in Ryan's expression. No hesitation. Just irritation, like Ethan had become an inconvenience that refused to quietly disappear. Ryan adjusted the cuff of his designer suit before walking forward through the crowd with smooth alpha confidence. The guests parted automatically for him. Ethan hated that his stupid heart still reacted to Ryan's scent even now, warm cedar and expensive cologne wrapping around years of memories Ethan suddenly wished he could erase. You should have answered my calls earlier, Ryan said quietly once he reached him. Ethan stared at him in disbelief. You canceled our engagement through a text message 30 minutes before the party. Ryan exhaled sharply like Ethan was exhausting him. I was trying to avoid making a scene. Ethan laughed once, soft and broken. You invited the entire city. Business changed. Ryan's tone hardened. You know how these things work. Ethan looked toward the beautiful Omega beside him. Younger. Richer. From one of the most powerful families in Illinois. Everything Ethan was not. So that's it? Ethan asked. 5 years together, and you trade me away for a bigger bank account? Ryan's jaw tightened slightly, enough to reveal irritation beneath the polished mask. Don't make this emotional. Emotional. Ethan felt something crack quietly inside his chest. Around them, the music continued. Servers carried silver trays through the ballroom while wealthy strangers watched his humiliation unfold like entertainment. Ethan suddenly realized Ryan wasn't embarrassed at all. Ryan thought he'd already won. You know what's funny? Ethan said softly. I actually defended you when people called you cold. Ryan's expression darkened. Ethan, no. Ethan stepped back. You don't get to say my name like you still deserve it. For a second, Ryan looked genuinely uncomfortable, but it vanished quickly beneath practiced indifference. You'll be fine, Ryan said. You always land on your feet. Ethan swallowed hard because that wasn't true. He'd built his entire future around Ryan. The apartment. The wedding plans. The promises whispered during late nights Ethan now realized meant absolutely nothing. The crowd seemed louder now. The lights too bright. His breathing became shallow beneath the crushing pressure building in his chest. He couldn't stay here another second. Without another word, Ethan turned and walked away while whispers followed him through the ballroom like shadows. He ignored them. Ignored the stares. Ignored the burning humiliation threatening to drown him alive. By the time he reached the hotel lobby, rain hammered violently against the glass windows overlooking the city streets. Thunder rolled somewhere above the skyline while black luxury cars lined the curb outside beneath glowing hotel lights. Ethan pushed through the revolving doors into the freezing rain without a coat. Water soaked through his dress shirt instantly, cold against his skin as he stumbled down the sidewalk. His chest hurt so badly he thought he might actually collapse. Chicago traffic blurred into streaks of white and red beneath the storm. Somewhere behind him, the hotel doors opened again, but Ethan didn't look back. He couldn't. If he looked back, he might completely fall apart. He reached the edge of the street just as a long black car pulled silently to the curb beside him. The vehicle looked impossibly expensive, sleek enough to belong in a movie rather than parked beside a soaked and heartbroken Omega trying not to cry in public. Ethan stepped away automatically. The back passenger door opened. At first, all Ethan saw was darkness inside the vehicle. Then polished black shoes touched the pavement. A tall man stepped out slowly beneath the rain, one hand adjusting the cuff of his charcoal coat with calm precision. The city itself seemed quieter around him. Ethan recognized him instantly even before the bodyguards emerged from the front vehicle behind them. Damian Moretti. Every newspaper in Chicago knew that face. Every businessman feared that name. Moretti Syndicate. Hotels. Shipping companies. Real estate. Private security. Rumors whispered behind closed doors about connections nobody was brave enough to confirm publicly. Damian looked unreal standing beneath the rain and neon city lights, tall and composed with dark hair dampened slightly by the storm. His silver eyes locked onto Ethan with terrifying focus. Not curious. Not surprised. Certain. Ethan's pulse stumbled painfully in his chest. Around them, traffic slowed. People on the sidewalk immediately crossed the street to avoid getting too close. Fear moved through the city around Damian Moretti like an invisible current. Damian stepped closer once. Then once more. Ethan should have backed away. Instead, he stood frozen beneath the rain, while Damian studied him in complete silence. The Mafia Boss finally removed his black wool coat and draped it over Ethan's shaking shoulders without asking permission. The warmth nearly broke him. Damian's voice was deep and calm when he finally spoke. He left you in front of everyone. Ethan's throat tightened painfully. What does that matter to you? Damian stared at him for a long moment, while rain poured around them in silver sheets. Then the most feared man in Chicago lifted one hand gently beneath Ethan's chin and said the words that would destroy Ethan's old life forever. Because from now on, Damian said quietly, you're mine. The world around Ethan Carter seemed to stop breathing after Damian Moretti said those four impossible words. Rain hammered against the sidewalk hard enough to blur the city lights into streaks of silver and gold, but Ethan barely noticed anymore. All he could focus on was the man standing inches away from him, calm and unreadable beneath the storm, while the entire street instinctively kept its distance. Damian Moretti did not raise his voice. He did not need to. Power clung to him naturally, woven into every movement, every glance, every quiet breath. Ethan's fingers tightened around the warm coat draped over his shoulders. It smelled faintly like cedarwood, smoke, and expensive cologne. The scent was dangerously comforting. I do not belong to anybody, Ethan managed softly, even though his voice shook from cold and humiliation and something far more terrifying he did not want to name. Damian studied him for several silent seconds. The city traffic moved carefully around the line of black vehicles behind him, while bodyguards stood at a respectful distance beneath umbrellas, pretending not to watch. No, Damian finally said. You belong to someone who did not know your value. Ethan swallowed hard. The words hit deeper than they should have. He should walk away. Any sane person would. Everything about Damian Moretti screamed danger. Men like him existed in whispered conversations and newspaper headlines, not standing in the middle of a rainstorm offering comfort to strangers. But Ethan was exhausted. Emotionally hollowed out. Ryan had just destroyed 5 years of his life in front of half the city, and somehow the only person looking at him right now like he still mattered was the most feared man in Chicago. Damian opened the car door beside him. Get in. It was not aggressive. Not harsh. Somehow that made it worse. Ethan hesitated. Why are you doing this? Damian's silver eyes remained fixed on him. Because I do not enjoy watching people break when I can prevent it. Ethan almost laughed at the absurdity of hearing something gentle come from Damien Moretti. People are terrified of you. That is usually a wise decision. Ethan looked down at the rain-soaked street. Logic screamed at him to leave. To call a friend. To disappear somewhere alone and cry until the ache in his chest stopped feeling unbearable. But another truth whispered quietly beneath the panic. There was nothing waiting for him anymore. The apartment belonged to Ryan. The engagement was over. Half the guests at that party were probably already posting articles and photos online. Ethan's humiliation would spread across social media before midnight. He suddenly realized he had nowhere to go tonight. Damien noticed the exact moment that realization hit him. Ethan saw it in the subtle shift in his expression. Not pity. Understanding. You can either stand here freezing while the city watches you fall apart, Damien said quietly, or you can come with me. Thunder rolled above the skyline. Ethan closed his eyes briefly before stepping toward the car. The interior was warm and impossibly luxurious, soft black leather glowing beneath dim amber lights. Ethan sat stiffly near the opposite door while Damien entered beside him with smooth, controlled movements. The second the door shut, the noise of the storm vanished completely. Silence settled over the vehicle like a heavy blanket. One of the bodyguards closed Damien's umbrella outside before the convoy finally pulled away from the curb. Ethan stared out the window at downtown Chicago sliding past in silver reflections. His pulse still had not slowed properly. You should probably take me home, Ethan muttered after several minutes. Damien leaned back slightly in his seat. Do you still consider that place home? Ethan did not answer because he could not. Damien's gaze moved briefly toward Ethan's trembling hands before returning to the window. You have not stopped shaking since you left the hotel. I am fine. Damien said nothing to that obvious lie. The silence inside the car felt strangely different from the silence Ethan had shared with Ryan during the last year of their relationship. Ryan's silence had always felt cold, dismissive. Damien's silence felt deliberate, as though he was giving Ethan room to breathe instead of demanding anything from him. It should not have mattered. But it did. The convoy eventually turned toward the northern edge of the city where skyscrapers gave way to private towers overlooking Lake Michigan. Ethan recognized the district immediately. Old money. Political power. Billionaires hidden behind tinted glass and private security. The black car disappeared into an underground entrance beneath one of the tallest towers Ethan had ever seen. Security gates opened instantly the moment Damien's vehicle approached. Nobody even checked identification. They already knew who owned the building. Ethan's stomach tightened as the car stopped inside a private garage lined with luxury vehicles worth more than most houses. One of the bodyguards opened Ethan's door before he could react. Damien stepped out first. Come with me. Ethan followed reluctantly through a silent private elevator that required fingerprint access before finally opening directly into a massive penthouse above the city skyline. Ethan stopped moving the second he stepped inside. Floor-to-ceiling windows stretched across the entire living space, revealing Chicago glowing beneath the rain like another universe entirely. White marble floors reflected soft, golden lighting while dark modern furniture filled the enormous penthouse with sharp elegance. Everything looked expensive, controlled, untouchable. It did not feel like a home. It felt like the center of someone's empire. Damien removed his watch calmly near the kitchen island before loosening the cuff of his black dress shirt. Even simple movements looked dangerously precise on him. You can stay here tonight, he said. Ethan stared at him in disbelief. That is not normal. Damien glanced toward him. Neither is abandoning your fiancé in front of 200 guests. Ethan looked away first. The words reopened the raw ache in his chest instantly. Damien noticed. Of course he noticed. Men like Damien probably noticed everything. There are guest rooms upstairs. Damien continued more quietly. Nobody will disturb you. Ethan folded his arms tightly across himself. And tomorrow? Damien walked slowly toward the windows overlooking the storm-dark city. His reflection stood tall against the skyline, cold and powerful and completely impossible to understand. Tomorrow, Damien said calmly, the city will wake up believing Ryan Keller destroyed your life. He turned slightly then, silver eyes settling on Ethan once again with terrifying certainty. They are wrong. Ethan barely slept. The guest bedroom Damien Moretti gave him was larger than Ethan's entire old apartment with Ryan, yet somehow the luxury only made him feel more out of place. The room overlooked Lake Michigan through towering glass windows streaked with rain, the city lights reflecting softly across polished dark wood floors and cream-colored walls. Everything smelled clean and expensive, like a world Ethan had only ever seen in magazines left behind at coffee shops. But no amount of luxury could quiet his thoughts. Every time Ethan closed his eyes, he saw Ryan standing beneath the chandelier beside someone else. He heard the whispers again. Poor Ethan. The humiliation clung to him like smoke. Sometime around 3 a.m, Ethan finally gave up trying to sleep and wandered downstairs barefoot, wrapped in the oversized sweater one of Damien's staff had quietly left in the room for him. The penthouse was silent except for the distant sound of rain against the windows. Ethan expected the place to feel empty at this hour. Instead, he found Damien standing alone beside the kitchen island with a glass of water in one hand and a phone pressed against his ear. No, Damien said calmly as Ethan entered the room. Tell them the meeting is postponed until next week. His voice remained low and controlled, but something about it made Ethan instinctively stop moving. I do not care what excuses Keller gives the board, Damien continued. His problem is no longer my concern. Silence followed before Damien ended the call without another word. Ethan realized too late that Damien had noticed him immediately. Silver eyes lifted toward him across the dim kitchen lighting. You should be asleep. Ethan folded his arms awkwardly. I could say the same thing to you. Damien set the phone down beside the marble counter. I rarely sleep much. Ethan believed him instantly. There was something restless beneath Damien's calm exterior, something sharp and tightly controlled. Even standing still, Damien looked like someone constantly carrying invisible pressure on his shoulders. Ethan moved toward the windows overlooking the city skyline. Your apartment is terrifying. Damien walked closer slowly. Most people call it impressive. Most people are probably afraid of you. Are you? Ethan hesitated longer than he should have. The honest answer was complicated. Damien intimidated him constantly. The man carried power the way storms carry thunder, impossible to ignore once you step too close. But strangely, Ethan had never once felt unsafe around him. Confused, yes. Overwhelmed, definitely. But not unsafe. I think I should be, Ethan admitted softly. Damien watched him carefully. And yet you stayed. Ethan looked down at the city lights far below. I did not have anywhere else to go. The words slipped out before he could stop them. Shame tightened painfully in his chest immediately afterward. Damien's expression shifted almost imperceptibly. Not pity. Something quieter. You are not a burden here, Ethan. Ethan laughed weakly. You barely know me. I know enough. Damien moved beside him near the windows, close enough for Ethan to notice the faint scent of cedarwood and black coffee surrounding him. You stayed loyal to someone who did not deserve it. That tells me more about your character than any background report could. Ethan blinked slowly. Background report? Damien remained perfectly calm. You did not think I brought a stranger into my home without knowing who he was. Ethan stared at him. That is incredibly unsettling. Probably. Damien sounded completely unbothered. Ethan shook his head softly before turning away from the windows. I should leave tomorrow. The silence that followed felt heavier this time. Damien studied him for several long seconds before speaking. Do you want to leave? Ethan opened his mouth automatically, then stopped. The answer should have been yes. Obviously yes. But another truth had started forming quietly inside him since arriving here. For the first time in months, nobody was criticizing him. Nobody was dismissing his feelings or making him feel inconvenient. Damien barely spoke half the time, Yet Ethan somehow felt more seen in this penthouse than he ever had standing beside Ryan at glamorous parties pretending to be happy. That realization terrified him. "I do not understand you," Ethan admitted quietly. Damien's gaze remained steady on him. "Most people do not." Ethan rubbed tiredly at his face. "Why me?" Damien did not answer immediately. Instead, he looked out toward the sleeping city below them. "Do you know what people become when they are powerful enough?" Ethan frowned slightly. "Arrogant?" A faint smile touched Damien's mouth for less than a second. "Lonely." Ethan looked at him carefully then. Really looked. Damien Moretti was beautiful in a dangerous sort of way, all sharp lines and cold elegance beneath tailored black clothing that probably cost more than Ethan's student loans. But there was exhaustion hiding beneath the perfection too. The kind of exhaustion that settled deep into someone's bones after carrying responsibility too long. Ethan suddenly realized Damien had probably spent years surrounded by people who feared him instead of knowing him. The thought made something ache unexpectedly inside his chest. "That still does not explain why you picked me up off the street like some stray cat," Ethan muttered. Damien's eyes darkened slightly with amusement. "You looked offended when I called you mine." Ethan nearly choked. "Because that was insane." "And yet," Damien said calmly, "you are still here." Ethan looked away quickly before Damien could notice the heat rising to his face. Somewhere beyond the windows, lightning flashed across the skyline. The city looked small from up here, distant and untouchable beneath the storm. Damien's phone buzzed again against the marble counter, but he ignored it completely. Ethan noticed that too. "You are not answering?" Damien barely glanced toward the device. "Nothing more important than this." Ethan's pulse stumbled unexpectedly. Before he could respond, one of the elevators chimed softly somewhere down the hallway. Damien's expression changed instantly. Not dramatic. Just colder. Sharper. A bodyguard appeared moments later near the entrance to the penthouse. "Sir," the man said carefully, "Ryan Keller is downstairs requesting a meeting." The entire room went silent. Ethan felt his stomach drop instantly. Damien, however, looked completely unsurprised. Slowly, deliberately, Damien picked up his untouched glass of water before speaking in a voice so calm it became terrifying again. "No," he said simply. "He is not." Ethan's heartbeat became uneven the moment Ryan's name entered the room. The warmth of the penthouse suddenly disappeared beneath a wave of anxiety so sharp it made his stomach twist painfully. Outside the windows, dawn had started bleeding slowly into the Chicago skyline, soft gray light spreading across the storm clouds above Lake Michigan, but inside Damien Moretti's penthouse the atmosphere turned cold enough to freeze the air itself. The bodyguard remained near the elevator entrance, waiting silently for instructions. Damien stood beside the marble counter with one hand resting lightly against the glass in his grip, perfectly composed in a way that almost felt unreal. Ethan realized then that Damien never reacted emotionally in front of other people. Every expression, every word, every movement, controlled, deliberate, dangerous. "He says it is urgent," the bodyguard added carefully. Damien did not even look in the man's direction. "Everything becomes urgent once people lose access to something they took for granted." Ethan lowered his eyes immediately because the words struck too close to the truth. Ryan had ignored him for months before the engagement party. Business trips, missed dinners, cold conversations that ended in frustration. Ethan had spent almost a year convincing himself things would improve if he just loved Ryan hard. Enough. Now Ryan was downstairs demanding access like Ethan suddenly mattered again. Damien finally set the glass down. "Tell security Mr. Keller is not welcome in this building." "Yes, sir." The bodyguard disappeared immediately. Silence settled across the penthouse once more. Ethan stared down at the marble floor beneath his bare feet. "You did not have to do that." Damien looked toward him calmly. "I know. Ryan probably just wants to explain." Damien's expression remained unreadable. "And do you want to hear his explanation?" Ethan opened his mouth, but no answer came out. Because honestly, he did not know anymore. Part of him still wanted answers. He wanted to understand how someone could promise forever one moment, and replace him publicly the next without hesitation. But another part of Ethan already knew the truth. Ryan had chosen power, money, convenience. Ethan simply had not been enough. Damien stepped closer slowly, his voice quieter now. People like Ryan only panic after they realize someone else values what they discarded. Ethan looked up at him. You talk like people are objects. Most wealthy men do. Damien's honesty startled him again. Ethan rubbed tiredly at his eyes. You really hate him? No. Damien's tone stayed calm. If I hated him, he would know. Something about the sentence sent a nervous chill through Ethan's chest. Before he could respond, Damien walked toward the kitchen espresso machine with smooth precision. Coffee? Ethan blinked at the sudden shift in conversation. What? You look exhausted. Damien glanced over his shoulder briefly. Coffee. Ethan stared at him for a second before letting out the smallest laugh he had managed since the engagement party. Somehow it escaped before he could stop it. Damien paused slightly at the sound. Ethan immediately covered his mouth. Sorry. Why? I do not know. It just feels strange. Damien turned back toward the machine. What does? You. Ethan leaned against the kitchen island carefully. You talk like someone threatening world domination 1 minute and then ask if I want coffee the next. A faint shadow of amusement crossed Damien's face. I contain multitudes. Ethan stared because that was unexpectedly funny coming from a man with enough authority to terrify half the city. Damien prepared the coffee himself instead of asking staff to do it. Ethan noticed that too. The Mafia Boss moved with the same careful control even during ordinary tasks, sleeves rolled slightly past his wrists, while early morning light reflected softly against his dark hair. There was something strangely human about watching someone so powerful quietly make coffee at 6 in the morning. It made Damien feel less untouchable somehow. Ethan accepted the warm mug carefully once Damien handed it over. Thank you. Damien leaned back against the counter across from him. You are welcome. They stood there in silence for several moments, while the city slowly woke beneath them. Ethan should still feel terrified. Instead, exhaustion mixed dangerously with comfort. The penthouse no longer felt quite as cold as it had last night. My phone has probably exploded by now, Ethan muttered eventually. Damien's gaze sharpened slightly. You have not checked it? Ethan shook his head. I cannot. He swallowed hard around the knot in his throat. I do not think I can handle seeing everyone talk about me yet. Damien nodded once like he understood completely. Then do not. Ethan frowned slightly. That is not realistic. Damien crossed his arms loosely. You are allowed to disappear from the world for 1 day, Ethan. The words settled softly inside Ethan's chest. Nobody had ever spoken to him like that before. Ryan would have called it dramatic, immature, emotional. But Damien simply treated Ethan's pain like something valid instead of inconvenient. That difference terrified Ethan more than anything else. Because he was beginning to realize how starved he had been for basic kindness. You barely know me, Ethan whispered again. Damien looked directly at him. And yet every instinct I have tells me someone spent a very long time making you feel small. Ethan's breath caught painfully. Damien noticed too much. Ethan looked away quickly toward the windows before Damien could see how close those words came to unraveling him completely. The sunrise painted the skyline in soft silver light now, turning the glass walls of the penthouse almost dreamlike. Ryan used to tell me I was too sensitive, Ethan admitted quietly. Too emotional. Too soft for his world. Damien's jaw tightened slightly. And did you believe him? Ethan stared down into his coffee. Eventually. Silence followed again. Then Damien stepped closer, close enough for Ethan to catch the faint scent of cedarwood surrounding him. Sensitivity is not weakness, Damien said calmly. It is the reason cruel people search for gentle ones in the first place. Ethan looked up slowly. Damien's silver eyes held his completely now, steady and intense enough to make Ethan's pulse stumble again. "You were not difficult to love, Ethan," Damien said quietly. "You were simply loved by the wrong person." Ethan spent the next 3 days inside Damien Moretti's penthouse pretending his life had not completely fallen apart. Outside, Chicago moved normally beneath cold November skies while social media exploded with headlines about Ryan Keller's cancelled engagement and sudden appearance beside the wealthy Omega heir everyone now called his perfect match. Ethan tried not to look at any of it. He failed exactly twice. The first article described Ethan as the unfortunate former fiancé. The second called him an emotional casualty of corporate realignment. After that, Ethan shut his phone off completely and buried it in the bottom drawer of the guest bedroom. Damien never mentioned the articles. He never pushed Ethan to talk about Ryan either. Instead, Damien simply adjusted around him in ways so subtle Ethan almost missed them at first. Meetings became quieter whenever Ethan entered a room unexpectedly. Staff members somehow learned Ethan preferred tea over coffee in the evenings. Fresh sketchbooks and expensive art supplies appeared near the living room windows after Damien noticed Ethan doodling absent-mindedly on a napkin during breakfast. Nobody announced these changes. They simply happened. It unsettled Ethan more than grand gestures ever could. Because Damien paid attention. Constantly. On the 4th morning, Ethan sat curled on the enormous living room couch sketching the skyline. While rain tapped softly against the penthouse windows, Damien stood near the dining table across the room reviewing documents with 2 sharply dressed men in dark suits. Ethan tried not to listen, but Damien's voice carried naturally through the quiet apartment. "Absolutely not," Damien said calmly while signing something with a fountain pen. "Keller Holdings lost 30% overnight. They are unstable now." One of the men adjusted his glasses nervously. "There are rumors Ryan Keller wants another meeting with you personally." Damien did not even look up. "Then Ryan Keller should learn how disappointment feels." Ethan's pencil paused against the paper. The men exchanged careful glances before quickly collecting their documents and leaving through the private elevator. The second the doors closed, silence settled over the penthouse again. Damien loosened the cuffs of his charcoal dress shirt before finally looking toward Ethan on the couch. "You are staring." Ethan blinked. "Sorry." Damien walked toward the kitchen slowly. "You have apologized at least 14 times this morning alone." Ethan frowned slightly. "You counted?" "I noticed things." That answer should not have affected Ethan as much as it did. Damien opened the refrigerator and removed a glass bottle of water before leaning casually against the marble counter. Even relaxed, he looked intimidating enough to stop conversations the second he entered a room. "You know," Ethan muttered while setting the sketchbook aside, "most people would be terrified living here." Damien tilted his head slightly. "And are you?" Ethan considered the question honestly. "Not anymore." Something unreadable flickered briefly across Damien's face before disappearing. "That may be unwise." Ethan stood from the couch carefully and crossed toward the windows overlooking the city. "Maybe." He hesitated before continuing quietly. "But you have never actually done anything to hurt me." Damien's expression became strangely distant for a moment. "Not intentionally." Ethan turned toward him immediately. "What does that mean?" Damien looked down at the water bottle in his hand rather than answering right away. "People close to me rarely remain untouched by consequences." Ethan frowned. "You talk like you are some kind of curse." "Perhaps I am." The answer carried no humor. Ethan stared at him carefully then. Damien always seemed untouchable on the surface. Controlled. Cold. Powerful enough to bend entire rooms around his presence. But sometimes Ethan caught flashes of something heavier underneath. Exhaustion. Loneliness. The quiet tension of someone constantly expecting disaster before it arrived. It made Ethan wonder how long Damien had lived like that. "You know what I think?" Ethan asked softly. Damien raised an eyebrow slightly. "That sounds dangerous." Ethan ignored the comment. I think people are so afraid of you that nobody bothers trying to understand you anymore. Silence followed immediately. Damien's silver eyes settled fully on Ethan now, intense enough to make his pulse stumble again. Understanding me would not improve their opinion. Maybe not. Ethan shrugged lightly. But I do not think you are what people say you are. Damien walked toward him slowly then, footsteps nearly silent against the marble floor. And what exactly do people say I am? Ethan swallowed hard as Damien stopped directly in front of him. Close enough now that Ethan could see faint shadows beneath Damien's eyes from lack of sleep. Dangerous, Ethan admitted quietly. Cold. Ruthless. Damien held his gaze steadily. And? Ethan hesitated. Lonely. Something shifted in Damien's expression then. Small. Almost invisible. But Ethan saw it anyway. The truth had landed somewhere unexpectedly deep. Before either of them could speak again, the private elevator chimed softly from across the penthouse. Damien's entire posture changed instantly. The warmth disappeared from the room so quickly Ethan almost felt the temperature drop. One of Damien's security men stepped out first. Sir, the guard said carefully. There is an issue downstairs. Damien's voice returned to that terrifying calm immediately. Explain. The guard glanced briefly toward Ethan before continuing. Ryan Keller arrived again approximately 10 minutes ago. Security denied entry as instructed. Ethan's stomach tightened painfully. Then. What is the issue? Damien asked. The guard shifted uncomfortably. Mr. Keller informed several reporters outside the building that he believes you are manipulating his former fiancé emotionally. Silence crashed through the penthouse. Ethan's face drained of color instantly. Reporters. Cameras. More headlines. More public humiliation. Damien, however, became terrifyingly still. Ethan had already learned stillness was far more dangerous on Damien than anger. Interesting, Damien said softly. The security guard remained frozen near the elevator. There is more, sir. Damien's silver eyes sharpened slightly. Continue. Mr. Keller told the press he intends to retrieve Ethan Carter personally. The room went completely silent after that. Ethan's chest tightened painfully again, but this time not from heartbreak. Fear. Not fear of Ryan exactly. Fear of becoming a public spectacle all over again. Damien slowly loosened the cufflinks of his black shirt one at a time with terrifying precision before finally speaking in a voice calm enough to send chills down Ethan's spine. No, Damien said quietly. He does not. Ethan could not breathe properly for the rest of the afternoon. Every television screen inside Damien Moretti's penthouse suddenly seemed dangerous. Every phone notification felt like another incoming disaster waiting to happen. Reporters had already gathered outside the tower by the time Ethan finally looked through the floor-to-ceiling windows again. Even from dozens of stories above the street, he could see camera flashes near the entrance below like tiny bursts of lightning against the gray Chicago afternoon. Ryan had turned everything into public entertainment again. Ethan wrapped his arms tightly around himself while standing near the windows, trying to ignore the painful pressure building in his chest. You should eat something. Damien's voice came calmly from behind him. Ethan did not turn around immediately. I am not hungry. That was not a question. Ethan finally looked back. Damien stood near the dining table in a perfectly tailored black suit, one hand adjusting the silver cuff of his shirt, while speaking quietly into an earpiece. The contrast between Damien's calm composure and the chaos happening outside somehow made Ethan feel even more unstable. They are calling me manipulative now, Ethan muttered bitterly. As if I force Ryan to abandon me. Damien removed the earpiece slowly. People with power often rewrite stories to avoid guilt. Ethan laughed weakly. And what about people like you? Damien's silver eyes settled fully on him. People like me do not bother rewriting stories. The answer should have frightened him. Instead, Ethan found himself staring again. Damien always looked impossibly controlled, like nothing in the world could truly shake him. But today there was something sharper beneath the surface. Not anger exactly. Possessiveness. Ethan realized with growing unease that Damien genuinely disliked anyone speaking about him publicly. Especially Ryan. "You should not involve yourself in this," Ethan said quietly. "Ryan is trying to provoke you." Damien walked closer with slow, measured steps. "And is it working?" Ethan hesitated because honestly he could not tell. Damien did not raise his voice. He did not slam doors or lose control. But the entire penthouse seemed to tense whenever Ryan's name appeared. Even Damien's staff moved more carefully now, like everyone sensed pressure building beneath the surface of something enormous and dangerous. Ethan lowered his eyes. "I do not want you dragged into my mess." Damien stopped directly in front of him. "Ethan." His name sounded different coming from Damien. Lower. Softer. More deliberate. Ethan looked up automatically. "You became my concern the second I brought you here." The words settled heavily inside Ethan's chest. Before he could respond, Damien's phone vibrated against the dining table. Damien glanced down briefly before answering immediately. "What?" Silence followed while Damien listened. Ethan watched the subtle shift happen in real time. Damien's expression did not visibly change, yet the atmosphere inside the room suddenly sharpened enough to make Ethan's pulse quicken. "When?" Damien asked quietly. Another pause. Then Damien's jaw tightened almost invisibly. "Understood." He ended the call instantly. Ethan frowned. "What happened?" Damien looked toward the windows for several seconds before answering. "Ryan Keller held an interview outside the building 15 minutes ago." Ethan's stomach dropped immediately. "What did he say?" Damien's voice remained calm. Too calm. "He implied you are emotionally unstable and incapable of making rational decisions after the engagement ended." Ethan felt like someone punched the air directly from his lungs. Of course Ryan would do this. Of course he would try turning Ethan into the irrational emotional omega who could not move on gracefully. Ethan closed his eyes briefly, shame burning hot beneath his skin. "I cannot do this again," he whispered. "I cannot become another headline." Silence followed. Then Ethan felt warm fingers gently wrap around his wrist. He looked up instantly in shock. Damien had touched him for the first time since the rain outside the hotel. His hand was steady. Warm. Careful. "Look at me," Damien said quietly. Ethan obeyed before he could stop himself. Damien's silver eyes locked onto his completely. "You are not weak because someone treated you cruelly." Ethan swallowed hard. Damien stepped slightly closer. "And you are not unstable because you are hurt." The gentleness in Damien's voice nearly unraveled him completely. Ethan's chest tightened painfully as emotions he had spent days suppressing threatened to spill over all at once. Ryan had spent so long making Ethan feel dramatic for having feelings at all that hearing someone defend his emotions felt almost unreal. "Why are you being kind to me?" Ethan whispered. Damien's thumb brushed once lightly against Ethan's wrist before he seemed to realize what he was doing and slowly released him. "Because nobody was kind to you when they should have been." The room fell silent again after that. Outside, rain began tapping softly against the windows once more while distant thunder rolled across the skyline. Ethan suddenly became painfully aware of how close Damien stood now. Close enough to smell cedarwood and black coffee again. Close enough for Ethan's pulse to become dangerously uneven. Damien's phone buzzed again before either of them moved. Damien glanced down. Immediately this time. Ethan saw the exact second something shifted behind Damien's eyes. Coldness returned instantly. "What is it?" Ethan asked nervously. Damien read the message silently before locking the screen. "Security intercepted one of Ryan Keller's associates attempting to access this floor through the underground garage." Ethan's face strained of color. "What?" "The situation is handled." Damien's voice remained perfectly controlled, but Ethan already understood enough now to know that calmness meant nothing good. "Handled how?" Damien looked directly at him. "They were removed from the building." Ethan's heartbeat became uneven again. Ryan would not actually try anything serious. Damien's expression remained unreadable. You still believe that because you loved him? Ethan looked away immediately because the words hurt precisely because they were true. Damien stepped toward the windows again, his reflection dark against the storm-covered skyline beyond the glass. Men like Ryan do not enjoy losing ownership publicly, Damien said quietly. Especially not to someone they cannot control. Ethan folded his arms tightly across himself. I am not property. Damien turned slightly toward him then. No, he agreed calmly. But Ryan is beginning to realize someone else sees your value now. Ethan's pulse stumbled again. And that bothers him? Damien's silver eyes darkened faintly. It terrifies him. The storm over Chicago finally broke sometime after midnight. Rain slammed violently against the towering glass windows of Damien Moretti's penthouse while thunder rolled across the skyline hard enough to shake the city beneath them. Ethan sat alone near the living room windows wrapped in a dark blanket from the guest room, sketchbook forgotten beside him, while anxiety slowly hollowed him out from the inside. He had tried sleeping twice already. Failed both times. Every time he closed his eyes, he imagined reporters outside the building. Cameras. Headlines. Ryan standing in front of microphones pretending Ethan was unstable while carefully protecting his own reputation. The humiliation felt endless. Ethan pressed his forehead lightly against the cool glass. Somewhere far below, the city lights blurred beneath sheets of rain while expensive black vehicles continued moving in and out of the tower garage. Damien's world never really slept. Neither, apparently, did Damien himself. Ethan heard footsteps behind him sometime around 1 in the morning. Calm. Steady. Familiar now. You are awake again. Ethan looked back over his shoulder. Damien stood near the entrance to the hallway wearing dark slacks and a black dress shirt with the sleeves rolled slightly past his wrists. His tie was gone. The top button near his collar undone. Somehow the less formal appearance made him even more intimidating instead of less. I could say the same thing to you, Ethan muttered softly. Damien walked toward the windows slowly. I had work. Ethan glanced toward the watch on Damien's wrist. At 1 in the morning? Problems do not respect office hours. Ethan let out a weak breath of laughter before looking back toward the storm outside. Damien stopped beside him in silence for several moments. Ethan had started noticing how often Damien allowed silence to exist naturally between them. Ryan always filled quiet moments with criticism or business calls or impatient sighs. Damien simply stood there beside him without demanding anything. It should not matter this much. But it did. You should stop reading articles about yourself, Damien said quietly. Ethan stiffened instantly. How did you know? A faint shadow of amusement crossed Damien's expression. Your sketchbook has not moved in 20 minutes. Ethan looked down guiltily at the untouched pencil beside him. I was curious. And? Ethan swallowed hard. People believe Ryan. Damien's silver eyes settled on him calmly. Do you? Ethan looked away immediately. No, then why does it matter? Ethan laughed softly, but there was no humor in it. Because everyone else does. Damien turned fully toward the windows, hands sliding into the pockets of his slacks. Public opinion changes constantly. Fear does not. Ethan frowned slightly. That sounds ominous. It is reality. Lightning flashed briefly across the skyline, illuminating Damien's reflection against the glass like something carved from shadow and silver. Ethan studied him quietly for a moment before speaking again. Can I ask you something? Damien glanced toward him once. You usually do. Ethan hesitated. Why are people so afraid of you? Silence followed immediately. Ethan thought Damien might ignore the question entirely. Instead, Damien stared out over the storm-dark city for several long seconds before finally answering. Because fear is useful. Ethan frowned. That sounds lonely. Another flash of lightning reflected across Damien's face. It is. The honesty startled Ethan enough that he forgot how to breathe for a second. Damien rarely talked about himself directly. Everything about him remained guarded behind calm expressions and controlled movements. Hearing loneliness admitted so openly from someone like Damien felt strangely intimate. Ethan lowered his voice. You really are alone, are you? Damien looked at him then. Truly looked at him. Most powerful men are. Ethan's chest tightened unexpectedly. Something about Damien standing there against the storm with that quiet exhaustion in his eyes suddenly made him seem less untouchable. Less like a terrifying myth from newspaper headlines and more like an actual person carrying too much weight alone. That is sad, Ethan admitted softly. Damien's expression shifted almost invisibly. Most people would call it deserved. Ethan shook his head immediately. I do not think you are a bad person. Damien stared at him long enough to make Ethan nervous. You should be careful offering trust so easily. I do not trust easily, Ethan said quietly. I trusted the wrong person once already. The words settled heavily between them. Damien stepped slightly closer. Ryan Keller taught you to question your own instincts. Ethan blinked in surprise. What? You apologize constantly even when you have done nothing wrong, Damien said calmly. You brace yourself every time you express emotion like you expect criticism afterward. Ethan's throat tightened painfully because Damien was right. Ryan used to call him dramatic whenever Ethan got upset. Sensitive whenever Ethan cried. Difficult whenever Ethan needed reassurance. Eventually, Ethan learned to shrink himself smaller and smaller just to keep peace inside the relationship. Damien noticed all of it within days. You observe too much, Ethan whispered. Damien's voice softened slightly. Someone should have. The room fell silent again except for rain crashing violently against the windows around them. Ethan looked down at his hands because suddenly emotions pressed too tightly inside his chest again. Before he could speak, the lights inside the penthouse flickered once from the storm outside. Thunder shook the building hard enough to make Ethan jump slightly. Damien noticed immediately. You dislike storms. Ethan looked embarrassed. I know it is stupid. It is not. Another loud crack of thunder rolled across the skyline. Ethan flinched again before he could stop himself. Damien studied him for half a second before quietly removing his suit jacket from the nearby chair and draping it over Ethan's shoulders without warning. The warmth and faint cedarwood scent wrapped around Ethan instantly. His pulse stumbled painfully. Damien, you are cold. Ethan looked up slowly. Damien stood impossibly close now beneath the dim city lights reflecting through the windows. Calm. Dangerous. Gentle in ways Ethan still did not fully understand. Outside, lightning flashed again across the storm-covered skyline. But for the first time all night, Ethan realized he was no longer paying attention to the thunder at all. The next morning Chicago woke beneath pale winter sunlight and another wave of headlines. Ethan discovered that much accidentally when he wandered into the penthouse kitchen and found one of the financial news channels playing silently on a television mounted near the dining area. Ryan Keller's face appeared beside a bold caption discussing his high-profile separation scandal, while commentators debated whether Damien Moretti's sudden involvement represented a personal interest or a strategic corporate move. Ethan froze instantly. A staff member noticed and quietly changed the channel before he could hear more. Sorry, Ethan murmured automatically. The older beta gave him a surprisingly sympathetic smile. You never need to apologize for existing here, sir. Ethan stared after him in shock long after the man disappeared down the hallway. Existing here. Nobody inside Damien's tower treated Ethan like an inconvenience. The realization still felt foreign enough to hurt. By noon the storm had completely passed, leaving Chicago wrapped in cold silver sunlight that reflected sharply off the frozen lake beyond the penthouse windows. Ethan sat cross-legged near the living room glass sketching again for the first time in weeks. Not absent-minded doodles this time. Actual art. The skyline spread across the page in soft charcoal shadows while winter light poured through the windows around him. He became so focused he barely noticed Damien enter the penthouse nearly an hour later. You stopped drawing after your engagement. Ethan startled slightly before looking up. Damien stood near the private elevator removing black leather gloves one finger at a time. Expensive charcoal coat. Dark tie loosened slightly near the collar. Cold winter air still clung faintly to him. Ethan's pulse betrayed him immediately. You scared me. Damien walked closer with slow, measured steps. That was not my intention. Ethan glanced down at the sketchbook again. How did you know I stopped? Damien's silver eyes settled on the unfinished skyline drawing. Your old gallery website still exists. Ethan blinked hard. You looked at my work? All of it. Heat crawled unexpectedly into Ethan's face. That is mildly terrifying. You say that often. Ethan tried to ignore the faint amusement in Damien's voice. Most people do not research someone's abandoned art career. Damien sat across from him near the windows, setting his gloves carefully on the marble table beside the couch. Most people do not create things that make loneliness look beautiful. Ethan's breath caught painfully in his chest. Nobody had ever described his art like that before. Ryan used to glance at Ethan's sketches for less than 10 seconds before changing the subject to something more important. Business. Networking. Investments. Ethan suddenly realized Damien had probably spent actual time studying every piece carefully enough to understand the emotions behind them. The thought made his chest ache in a completely different way now. You really do notice everything, Ethan whispered. Damien watched him steadily. Only the things that matter. Silence settled softly between them again. Comfortable now instead of tense. Ethan hated how quickly he had started recognizing Damien's presence as safety. It should alarm him more than it did. You missed lunch, Damien said eventually. Ethan frowned slightly. How do you know that? Damien raised an eyebrow. You think nobody tells me when you skip meals? Ethan stared in disbelief. You have people monitoring whether I eat? You forget to take care of yourself when anxious. Ethan opened his mouth to protest before realizing Damien was unfortunately correct. That is still incredibly controlling. Probably. Damien sounded entirely unapologetic. Ethan shook his head weakly. You are impossible. And yet you remain here voluntarily. Ethan looked away immediately because once again Damien was right. Days ago Ethan stayed because he had nowhere else to go. Now the truth had become far more dangerous. He stayed because leaving no longer felt right. The realization frightened him enough that he stood abruptly from the floor. I should probably look for an apartment soon. The atmosphere inside the penthouse changed instantly. Not dramatically. Just enough for Ethan to notice Damien becoming very still again. Why? Damien asked quietly. Ethan avoided his eyes while closing the sketchbook. Because I cannot live here forever. Damien stood slowly from the couch. Who said forever? Ethan's pulse stumbled unevenly. Damien, do you want to leave? Ethan looked up then because the question sounded different this time. Not possessive. Not commanding. Something quieter. More honest. Damien stood only a few feet away now beneath the pale winter light spilling through the windows. Calm silver eyes locked onto Ethan's completely. Waiting. Ethan swallowed hard. I do not know what this is. Damien answered immediately. Neither do I. The honesty stunned him again. Damien stepped closer slowly. But I know I dislike the idea of you leaving. Ethan's heartbeat became painfully uneven. That is dangerous to say to someone already emotionally confused. A faint shadow of amusement crossed Damien's expression before fading just as quickly. You are not confused, Ethan. Damien's voice lowered slightly. You are simply unused to being cared for without conditions attached. The words landed directly against every broken part of Ethan's heart. He looked away instantly because suddenly emotions pressed too tightly inside his chest again. Damien noticed, of course he noticed. He always did. Ryan Keller made affection feel transactional. Damien continued quietly. You expect kindness to disappear the second you disappoint someone. Ethan's throat tightened painfully. Please stop understanding me so well. Damien moved even closer then. Close enough now that Ethan could see the faint exhaustion beneath his composed exterior again. Close enough for cedarwood and winter air to wrap softly around him. I am trying, Damien admitted quietly. to understand you better. Ethan's breath caught completely. The city skyline glittered beyond the windows around them, while silence stretched tight between their bodies. No reporters. No headlines. No judgmental whispers. Just Damien standing impossibly close beneath winter sunlight with an expression Ethan still could not fully decipher. Then Damien lifted one hand slowly and brushed a faint streak of charcoal from Ethan's cheek with careful fingers. Gentle. Deliberate. Like Ethan was something fragile worth protecting. There, Damien murmured softly. Ethan forgot how to breathe entirely. 3 weeks later, the city still talked about Ethan Carter and Damien Moretti like they were some kind of dangerous modern fairy tale. Reporters camped outside the tower almost daily now hoping for photographs. Financial blogs speculated endlessly about Damien's sudden public interest in a previously unknown Omega artist. Socialites whispered during charity galas and expensive dinners about the terrifying Mafia Boss who seemed to have developed an obsession with protecting someone soft enough to blush whenever cameras pointed in his direction. Ethan tried not to pay attention anymore. It became easier once he stopped hiding. Inside the penthouse, Damien changed that too. Slowly. Carefully. Like he understood Ethan frightened easily after everything Ryan had done to him publicly. Damien never forced him into crowded events or demanding social appearances. Instead, he simply started bringing pieces of the outside world safely closer again. Private art galleries after hours. Quiet restaurants with rooftop views and no reporters allowed inside. Late-night drives through downtown Chicago beneath glowing winter lights while snow drifted softly against black car windows. Ethan found himself breathing easier around Damien with every passing day. The fear never disappeared completely. But it changed shape. One snowy evening Ethan stood inside a small downtown art studio staring in disbelief at the freshly painted sign near the entrance windows. Carter Studio. The letters gleamed softly beneath warm interior lights while snow fell quietly across the sidewalks outside. Ethan turned toward Damien instantly. "What is this?" Damien stood near the doorway in a dark wool coat, silver eyes calm beneath the soft amber lighting. "A studio." Ethan laughed once in complete disbelief. "I can see that." Damien removed his leather gloves slowly. "The lease is already finalized." Ethan stared at him harder. "You bought me an art studio?" "No." Damien stepped closer. "I invested in one." Ethan's chest tightened painfully. The space around them smelled faintly like fresh paint and cedarwood. Large windows overlooked a quieter section of downtown lined with bookstores and cafes instead of corporate towers. Easels stood neatly near the walls beside untouched canvases and professional lighting equipment Ethan never could have afforded alone. "Damien," Ethan whispered, overwhelmed. "This is too much." "No," Damien said softly. "It is overdue." Ethan looked away quickly because emotions rose too fast inside his chest again. Ryan used to call art a hobby. Impractical. Childish. He once told Ethan nobody built real futures painting emotions onto canvas. But Damien had quietly built Ethan an entire future around the very thing Ryan dismissed. "Why would you do this for me?" Ethan asked quietly. Damien's expression softened almost invisibly. "Because every time you draw, you stop looking sad." Ethan's breath caught painfully. Silence filled the studio while snow continued falling gently outside the windows. Ethan suddenly realized nobody had ever cared enough to notice something that small before. Damien stepped closer slowly until only a few feet separated them. "You deserve a life that belongs to you," Damien said quietly. Ethan shook his head weakly. "You make it sound so simple." "It should have been." Ethan looked down at his hands. "I am still trying to understand why you care this much." Damien was silent for several seconds before finally answering. "Because somewhere between the rain outside that hotel and now..." He paused briefly like the admission itself felt unfamiliar. "You became important to me." Ethan's heartbeat stumbled unevenly. Damien rarely spoke directly about emotions. Everything meaningful between them usually lived inside gestures instead. Warm jackets placed carefully around Ethan's shoulders. quiet protection, gentle patience. Late-night conversations near storm-covered windows. Hearing the truth spoken aloud felt almost overwhelming. Ethan looked up slowly. Important? Damien held his gaze completely now. Very. The city outside glowed softly beneath falling snow, while silence stretched tight between them again. Ethan realized suddenly he was no longer afraid of what people might say about them. No longer afraid of headlines or reporters or Ryan Keller pretending Ethan was unstable simply because someone finally treated him with care. Because standing here now inside a studio Damien created just for him, Ethan understood something painful and freeing at the same time. Ryan never truly loved him. Someone who loved Ethan would never have humiliated him publicly just to protect their own reputation. Someone who loved Ethan would have noticed when he stopped drawing. Damien took another step closer. You are thinking too loudly again. Ethan laughed softly through the tightness in his throat. That is because you keep saying impossible things. A faint shadow of amusement touched Damien's face. And yet you are smiling. Ethan blinked in surprise. Because Damien was right. For the first time in weeks, maybe months, he genuinely was. Snow continued drifting quietly outside while warm light filled the studio around them. Ethan suddenly realized this place no longer felt temporary. Neither did Damien. I should probably thank you properly, Ethan murmured softly. Damien's silver eyes darkened slightly with warmth. You already did. How? Damien looked at him with that same calm, terrifying focus from the very first night they met. Except now Ethan finally understood there had always been gentleness beneath it too. You stay, Damien said quietly. Ethan's chest ached so painfully he almost looked away again. Instead, he stepped closer until barely any space remained between them. I think, Ethan admitted softly, I stopped wanting to leave a long time ago. Something vulnerable flickered briefly across Damien's expression then disappeared beneath relief so subtle most people would have missed it entirely. Ethan did not miss it. Not anymore. Outside, Chicago moved endlessly beneath winter skies and glowing city lights while people continued whispering stories about the feared Mafia Boss and the Omega he protected like something precious. But inside the quiet warmth of the studio, none of that mattered. Because for the first time in Ethan Carter's life, someone looked at him like he was worth choosing every single day. Damien lifted one hand slowly and brushed his fingers lightly against Ethan's cheek with impossible gentleness. No one, Damien said quietly, will ever make you feel abandoned again.